This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So once again, my name is Crystal. I'm the president of the Rose Society of Tucson. I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. We'll get started. Les, are you there? I don't see Les.
He's here.
I see his icon.
He is. Okay. All right.
He's here in the guise if we can't get this whole thing up and running right.
Oh, no. Okay. Like Suzanne, I can hear you. Can
Right, and I've already hit share my webcam and nothing happened. Okay, that should put him, okay,
There
good.
you go.
Okay. All right, Les, do you want to tell us what's going on this month in the garden?
Sure.
Okay, and then hit that, turn it off.
Well, it's trying to be spring, but keeps bouncing back and forth. I live near the university, and we were down to 27 degrees yesterday morning in the neighborhood. So, and then up to 80 today. So it's been typical spring and windy, and supposed to be really windy tomorrow. So just make sure your roses are pretty well hydrated. You don't want them to get too dried out. And it's hard to come up with a watering schedule this time of year because of the big change in temperature. Although our humidities have been so low that you really also have to keep that in mind for watering. My big pots, I'm soaking them every 3 days. And I still wash my roses off every single morning. Last Saturday, I noticed the first lacewings were around, which means that aphids aren't too far behind. So you need to keep an eye out for them. If you have a very light infestation of aphids, you can usually keep them under control just by washing them off with a stream of water. If you get a heavy infestation, you may have to go to something else. But I've never had much problem controlling them just with water. I don't think we're going to have much of a thrip this year because most of our thrips come in off of the wildflowers, and there's not going to be any wildflowers since we had no rain. So I don't think you're going to get any, lower infestation of thrips. And of course, since we're not having a show, you don't have to be quite as picky about the thrips ruining your flowers. If they're just a minor nuisance or a little bit of browning here and there, I don't think I'd be trying to throw a lot of chemicals at them to try and keep them under control. You should be onto a good feeding schedule. I've been feeding about every 10 days with Magnum Grow. My roses have already had alfalfa pellets. They've had a slow release fertilizer and Epsom salt. And tomorrow, if I have time, they're going to get a big shot of blood meal. Blood meal is a really good organic source of nitrogen. It's probably the highest nitrogen you can get in an organic source. But it does take a while to break down, which is good. You don't get just this big shot right away. Hopefully you've got your roses. I noticed in the Thripator that people have had a hard time getting the roses that they ordered from online, and due to the pandemic assorted issues. And I hope you get your roses soon, because if you have to wait much longer, it's going to be really tough on them. If you do get them in, like it said in the Thripator, soak them for 24 hours. If the canes on them are more than 12 inches long, cut them back to at least 12 inches and maybe down to about 9 inches long, and soak them overnight in a bucket of water. You could even soak them for 2 or 3 days. It won't hurt anything. And you can soak the whole bush clear up to the top. It won't hurt anything at all, and it helps to hydrate the canes also. Anybody got any questions?
Doesn't look like it. All right. Well, thank you, Les. Does anybody else have anything to add before we get our program started? Okay. Just a reminder, if you could mute yourself during the talk, there's a little chat feature that you can use if you do have questions throughout the presentation, and we'll make sure to get those addressed by the end of it all. Terry, can you introduce our speaker for tonight?
I certainly can. Well, we're really in the presence of someone who's very distinguished, very knowledgeable, and who I also consider a good friend, and has a lot of expertise, not only with roses, but with just gardening in general. And he's been working for ADOT for like about 200 or 300 years, I think, when we had wiki-ups along the side of the road. But he's also a great resource for information for growing any kind of plant. And so we're going to talk about soils and the foundation of all of our gardens. So here he is, LeRoy Brady.
Before LeRoy gets going, are you seeing the preview screen or are you seeing full screen on your side?
I'm seeing a preview. There's a next slide off to the right.
Hold on a second. Is that better?
Yes,
No.
better.
You should be able to see
There it
just the slides now.
Okay. Yes.
Can you make it full screen? Because on mine it's split in half.
Oh, it is. Okay. I thought it was. Okay. Then it was. Hold on. We got to find the swap screen here. I swapped it and now the swap screen disappeared. Hold on a second. I'll tell you, LeRoy, why don't you start talking? I will work on this in the background.
Okay. Last, when you were talking about roses that come in, I received some test roses last Wednesday that there were 2 rose bushes in a cardboard box. They had been shipped on Monday and they arrived on Wednesday. And the only thing wrapping them was a sheet of brown paper, and those roses were absolutely dry. No moisture any place on those roses. I've got them soaking in a bucket of water, and I think one of them may recover, and the other one is pretty much on its way out. So we'll get started with all about plants and roses, and it all begins with soils. Now, we've got several people like Lou Pavlovich and Terry that want the nature and properties of soils. It's 890 pages, but then we've got Liz and Donaldina and Diane that opted out for the short story, the 20-page thing on soil. So we're going to go with the 20-page, use that as a basis for what we're going to talk about today or tonight. Soil is a mixture of inorganic solids, organic solids, air, water, and microorganisms. And when we talk about it, and we'll talk about some of the different fertilizers. Even though they may be organic fertilizers, they have to break down into inorganic solutions. There was a recent PBS Science Friday. It was January 22nd. It had a segment on how soil could save the planet. And this is a link to that, but you can Google Science Friday and then go to January 22nd. And that segment was absolutely fascinating about soils and how important they are and the role they even play in relation to carbon and capturing carbon. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It's really entertaining and it's really informative. When we talk about soils, we're talking and we have to understand the principle of limiting factor. And what that states is the level of crop production, and in our case, we're talking about roses, can be no greater than that allowed by the most limiting of the essential plant growth factors. And those factors are climate, water, and nutrients. And the cube at the right shows all of the micronutrients that are necessary for plant growth. And if any one of them is tied up or not available, you're limiting the growth. And when the other thing about soils is you can add too much and you can have not enough, and that also has major effects. So we have to also remember our, what was it, 9th and 10th grade physics classes. For every action, there is a reaction. That applies to soils and the effect to plants too. So when we add things, it's also having an effect. Okay, plants require these mineral nutrients. And the macronutrients are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Those are the nutrients that they have to have a large amount of. The micronutrients that are small amounts that are required are iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, chlorine, cobalt, molybdenum, and nickel. Okay. Of the 18 elements, in the large quantities, there are these three come from the air and water. And if you remember, a number of times we've said that air is as important in the soil as is water, because the plants are getting carbon, they're getting hydrogen, and they're getting oxygen from the air and the water. Also, in the macronutrient column, by solution, they're getting phosphorus, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Now we've gone through those that large quantities are required. Let's go into the micronutrients. The iron, the manganese, the boron, zinc, copper, chlorine, cobalt, molybdenum, and nickel. And the boron, zinc, and copper, you have to be pretty darn careful with those, because just a tiny bit too much is toxic. Along the highways down by Benson, we run into some layers of soil down there that have excessive boron. And you could tell when tumbleweeds their roots would go down into that layer with the boron, those tumbleweeds would just curl up and die and turn brown. The zinc in our rose lore, the Macy's Valley rose lore, Steve Sheard last month did an article on zinc and how he got too much zinc. And he had his soil tested, and it was excessive zinc, and he lost a lot of roses last year because of that zinc. And what he determined was the source of that zinc was he had a friend who had horses. Those horses had been had zinc additives in their horse pellets, and so the horse manure that his friend was dropping off was really high in zinc, and even though it was composted, it ended up killing a number of his roses. And so he, as of a couple of weeks ago, had removed the soil and was replanting roses. The supply and availability of nutrients, there are 6 environmental factors: light, mechanical support, heat, air, water, and nutrients. And except for light, the soil supplies all are part of these external factors. The light is important because that's how we get photosynthesis, that's how we get growth. The soils give us support for our plants. We've all seen where as winter hits that the temperature slows down the growth. And as we talked about earlier, we need air, water, and then the nutrients. Let's look at some of the forms of elements. The inorganic forms are transported in solution through the plant and for photosynthesis. The plant can't take up the nutrients until they are both by bacterial and microbial and water put in solution. So organic solids must be changed by microbial and chemical action. So we need to keep that in mind. Even though we like to use organic fertilizers, they still take time to break down so that the plants can use it. Let's go through some of the elements and their effect. The nitrogen, this is the nutrient that gives plants growth, and it increases gives crisp leaf quality. And the symptom is a yellowing of leaves, and shoots will get real short if there's not enough nitrogen. Most of the time with the additives of fertilizers we've got, nitrogen is not much of a problem. Phosphorus, this phosphorus is important for root growth. It also encourages flowering and seed formation, and it hastens maturity and an energy bond. Phosphorus is, we have some areas of our state that are a little low in phosphorus. And as we get into some of the fertilizers, we'll talk about phosphorus in the different forms of phosphorus a little bit. A lack of phosphorus is purpling of leaves, delayed maturity, leaves are dark green tips, die early, and there's some defoliation. Potassium increases the vigor and gives disease resistance. And it helps a rose from a standpoint, or plants from a standpoint of stability and stiff canes and stalks. A symptom of a lack of it would be mottling or curling of leaves, firing of margins, midrib grain plants, and they lodge easily. Calcium promotes early root formation and growth, and it improves plant vigor. It's the calcium in the cell walls that give the plant structure. And calcium is, in order for the plant to use calcium, when we get down to boron, it's boron that helps in the assimilation of the calcium in the plant. Lack of calcium is death of terminal bud, leaves, and it'll have a wrinkled appearance along the margins. Okay, sulfur. Sulfur is a protein formation, promotes root growth, stimulates seed production, and young leaves have a general yellowing, but not along the midrib. Stalk short and slender. Iron is essential for chlorophyll production and production of synthesis. We're all familiar with chlorosis because in our soils, which tend to have a high pH, pH of 8 to 8.6, iron frequently gets tied up, and so we end up using, and we'll talk about a couple of things that provide iron. Magnesium, it's a component of chlorophyll, aids in translocation, and the older leaves will be light green, mottled with dead spots. Zinc is part of an enzyme system, formation of growth hormones, mottled leaves, internal chlorosis, and white buds. Manganese, it functions in enzyme systems and certain nitrogen transformations, dead spots, scabs, overleaf, and these symptoms are quite subtle. Boron, the rate of water absorption and sugar translocation, and also the utilization in photosynthesis and development of cell walls. And the boron symptom is really has an effect on the flower, and the terminal buds die. Copper. Copper is involved in plant respiration and utilization, iron, vitamin A, and the symptom is permanent wilting of young leaves and weak stalks. Molybdenum, it's required for nitrogen fixation, activation of enzymes, and reduces nitrates, and it's intensified chlorosis. Plants become stunted. Chlorine is necessary for osmosis and ionic balance and role in photosynthesis. And cobalt is a component of vitamin B12. And when we're talking about boron, years ago when Bob Martin, our president of ARS, lived in Gilbert, I went over to his rose garden and we were walking and looking at some of the roses, and he had a rose there, a couple of roses that he said, "LeRoy, I have poured iron on these roses, and they're not developing, and they look chlorotic, and it just isn't working. They're not taking it up." And I looked at the rose leaves, and it's just a tiny different look than iron chlorosis. But I said, "Bob, I really think these roses are short on boron." And about a month later, Bob said, "LeRoy, you were absolutely right." While we talked about boron being deadly to plants, the rate of application of boron is 1.25 acres or pounds per acre, or about a tablespoon per gallon or per 1,000 square feet. So that's not very much boron, and that's all it takes for that element to make sure that the roses or not problematic. Go ahead. So these are some of the symptoms. Iron is chlorosis, phosphorus, the leaves turn purple. Let's go to the next. Potassium, the leaves tend to be bluish. Iron is chlorosis, like we were talking about, the yellowing of leaves, the veins stay dark. The other thing about iron that we have to remember too is that iron does not translocate in the plant, does not move through the plant to the older foliage. So if it comes out chlorotic, that foliage is going to stay chlorotic until that iron deficiency, and then the new growth will demonstrate that there's enough iron there. Providing nutrition from inorganic and manufactured fertilizers. The pros, it tends to be a lower unit cost. It is a specific chemistry. Most of the manufactured fertilizers have a rapid availability to plants. It moves through the soils and they move through the soils to the roots. And it's important to understand that. The cons, application may affect availability of other elements. It does require precise application, and it can affect the roots and microorganisms in the soil if you over apply. The precise application is required because too much of commercial fertilizers or strong fertilizers can burn the root hairs and burn the root systems, and then you lose the plant. Okay, next. Compost. An important thing about compost is that it changes clay and sandy soils to act like loam soils. And our desert soils are extremely low. They're most of them are less than 1% organic material. And you look at places like Iowa and Illinois and the Midwest, those soils are up around 5%, but ours are, for the most part, less than 1%. Compost helps provide aeration. It has a water holding capacity, and makes it so water moves through the soil better, especially in clay soils. Compost adds nutrients, and it adds nutrient holding capacity. Compost is not just compost. There are some technical things about compost, and there are some national standards on compost. Within ADOT, we have a pretty tight specification for both broadcast applied compost as well as hydraulically applied compost that we use on every project that we seed. A couple of things about compost are that when compost first started to be used, much of the compost was not really compost. It had not been broken down to the point, and if it's hydrophobic or it resists wetting and water, that usually means that the compost hasn't had enough time composting. There are tests for stability of compost, and there are tests for maturity as well as stability. And so compost, just like our soils, if you've got questions on it, it does pay to have the soil tested and know what you're adding and know what your limitations are, where you've got enough nutrients, where you don't have enough nutrients. Okay. when you walk into a nursery, there are all kinds of things out there that you may want or you may not want, but it pays to know what your goal is and what your needs are, so that you're not wasting money on it. And they're both organic and inorganic, and we're looking at a shelf of mostly organic right now. And there are chemicals. Notice right there in the front is the soil sulfur, and there's blood meal there, and blood meal, like Les said, is high in nitrogen. It breaks down, and it's an organic material. Potting mix, it pays to buy a good grade of potting mix. And there are a number of brands around, and some of them are really, you don't want to use, but go with a good brand that has been properly prepared, and your plants will thrive as opposed to not making it. Grow Well is an Arizona company, and in Tucson, you have a company there that's also making potting mix and does a pretty good job of composting. I like, when I'm potting plants, to include some worm castings, and this is a bag that I buy at the nursery. It's got worm castings in it. It's got kelp and a little bit of rock dust in it. And I like using worm castings in my potting mix. Frequently, there are eggs of worms, and by adding a little bit, you begin to develop some earthworms in your potting mix. Okay. Synthetic fertilizers, Miracle-Gro is a big one. Les mentioned one that he uses. Miracle-Gro, to a great extent, is made for more Midwestern soils. However, potting mixes tend to be a little lower pH, and the Midwestern fertilizers work fair in it. Okay. Always look at the analysis on the fertilizer. This is a can of Key-Rex, and the slide doesn't show it, but Key-Rex is a chelated iron, and it also has milorganite in it, and it does work for treating chlorosis, iron deficiency on, I've had success with it on citrus trees as well as roses. This is a product that's been out just a few years, and there are several brands that do it. It's low in nitrogen, high in phosphorus, and it includes a rooting hormone to promote root stimulator. And some of the roses that I've planted, test roses that I've planted in the rose garden, I have used this rose stimulator to stimulate rooting early in the year, so that the plants have a better chance of going through the summer. Osmocote, a number of us do use Osmocote. It's a fertilizer that it's fairly high in nitrogen, but it is coated with a vegetable wax, so that the nitrogen is released slowly, and it resists burning. A lot of nurseries use this on the plants that they grow and sell. And a number of us use it on, especially on container plants. And this is the analysis of it. And while it's inorganic, it because of that coating, it breaks down and won't burn the roots of the plant. Mill organite. This is a product that's been around since the 30s, and it is sewage sludge from the Milwaukee sewage treatment plant or sewage treatment plants that they license to produce mill organite. It's low in nitrogen. It's about 5% nitrogen, but the iron that's in it, about 3%, is in a chelated form that doesn't tie up in our soils severely, and so that iron stays available. People who plant winter lawns, mill organite works well because since it is only 5% nitrogen, it adds just enough nitrogen, but at the same time, because of the iron, it greens up the lawn, so the lawn maintains a dark green appearance without it being high in nitrogen, which fertilizers that are high in nitrogen tend to promote rapid growth, and rapid growth in a lawn means mowing twice a week. Earth-friendly materials, those have really increased in the last 8 to 10 years. And there are all kinds of things available. I like to try them, and sometimes they're successful and many times they're not. In talking to the Soils Lab, IAS laboratory, who do soils testing all over Arizona and northern Mexico. This is a low nitrogen, but a high phosphorus and some potash fertilizer. The Organo brand of fertilizers is manufactured for our soils in Arizona. There are some other brands, Vigoro and some others that, and a lot of Scott's fertilizers have diammonium phosphate. Diammonium phosphate is particularly effective in the Midwest for their soils. Monoammonium phosphate is the best form of phosphorus for our soils, and monoammonium phosphate has a pH of about 8.5. Excuse me. Monoammonium phosphate has a pH of 4.5, and so it stays active in the soil. The diammonium phosphate has a pH of 8.5, and it becomes tied up in the soil. Remember, on your fertilizers, the first number is nitrogen, the second number is phosphorus, the third number is potash, and then usually after that is sulfur. But this is readily available in Arizona nurseries and is a good fertilizer for keeping plants in pots going as well as in your garden without adding too much nitrogen all at once. This is a commercial fertilizer, and look, 16-8-12. I've killed a few plants with this fertilizer because of the high nitrogen. You really have to be careful with these high nitrogen fertilizers. This is a fertilizer. They used to have a slogan on there that it was recommended by the Tucson Rose Society. I see now that that's been taken off. It is produced in Utah. It is an organic fertilizer, 585, and that's a pretty good combination for our types of soils. And this is a good fertilizer on roses. A bag of this, last year it was about 23 bucks. This year it's 29. And this is a little more about that. But this is a good fertilizer. A lot of people here in both Phoenix and in Tucson have used Miller's for a number of years. This is an example of some of the new brands, and you can see, and these are all organic fertilizers, and you can see that they're all fairly low nitrogen, and but they are good fertilizers. I have used both the Rose and the all-purpose. Fish fertilizer, you can see there that it's low nitrogen, 2.9, 3.5, and 0.3. And fish fertilizer adds a little bit of organic. There are a number of people that do use the fish fertilizers. Those people who have feral cats in their neighborhood tend to not want to use fish fertilizers. And it can create a sensation going out into your rose garden for a day or two after using this. This is compost, bulk, and this pile is probably about 10 or 15 yards. But this is the kind of compost that we were spreading last Saturday in the rose garden at Mesa Community College. And this is a close-up of that compost. It's fairly fine, but it does have some material in it. One thing to remember with compost, it does break down fairly fast because of our high summer temperatures. And we, in the rose garden, put any place from 120 cubic yards to 160 cubic yards down in the rose garden. I like to put down about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in my rose garden. The compost is important from a couple of standpoints, not just the nutrients, but it also helps insulate the soil from the heat and helps keep in the moisture. I put this in because this is a product that's not widely known, and it's certainly not in a lot of, it is in a number of nurseries. Physan is a chemical that in our Rose Society, we have a lady that is a nurse. Physan is a chemical that's used as a disinfectant in hospitals, but nurseries and growers have found that it is particularly good for controlling powdery mildew. It's a bactericide, an algicide, a viricide, and fungicide. And it's fairly inexpensive, $10 per quart. And I've had a quart and that's lasted me several years. And so if you do have mildew already, it's not a preventative, but it is a curative. And thank you. And this rose, I took this picture last week And this rose happens to be a K&M rose on Fortuniana from K&M Nursery in Mississippi. And the name of this rose is Lauren Lay. And Lauren Lay is a sport of the rose Elizabeth Taylor. And a number of us can remember when Elizabeth Taylor came out. It was a beautiful rose. Well, this is a sport of that rose. Any questions?
Yes, looks like we do have some questions. First off, how do you get rid of extra zinc?
Remove the soil. Zinc can leach some, but that is a slow process. So that's why you want to be very careful and not get too much zinc in. Zinc leaches, boron leaches, and that's why periodically, once in a while, we have to add some of those, even though they can be toxic. But you have to be really careful. That's also a reason for periodically testing soil so that you know what your level of some of those things are.
Okay. Next question, what soil mix do you like to use in your rose garden, which produces a perfect matrix for great root growth? With that being said, what is the soil mix at Mesa Community College for the spectacular rose garden there?
I can tell you that when we planted the section 4 of that rose garden, which was down in a detention basin, where the year before they had removed all the topsoil, and in fact they had removed 2 feet of the topsoil, and we were down in a caliche layer. We were planting roses, and Mary Lou Kaufman's comment was, I don't know why we're planting these roses. Nothing's going to grow down. Well, it turns out that when we planted those roses, we added some of the compost that I showed you pictures of, and we added about a quart of male organite to each rose pit that we planted. Now that section of rose garden has some of the healthiest roses in it. And that was planted about 2006 to 2008. So it's a combination of some compost. I do not like to mix compost more than about a foot to a foot and a half deep, because once you get down to that level, you're getting down to a low level of oxygen in the soil, and you're too apt to develop an anaerobic breakdown of that organic material. And that anaerobic breakdown is sulfides and other things, and that can kill the roots. So I tend to try to keep the compost up fairly close to the surface and minimize organics down deep.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Next question. You've probably heard of every miracle fertilizer that has ever come out. What are some of them you have seen and tried? Also, what fertilizer regimen have you found that produces the best roses possible each spring?
Well, I'll tell you, I would love to have $1 for every product that has come across my desk, or that I've had a salesman in the 53 years I've been a landscape architect for the Department of Transportation. I'd love to have $1 for every type of fertilizer and every type of bacteria and microbial thing that is supposed to make stuff grow. And it just gets down to soils are so variable. It is trying some things out on your own and learning the basics, and that all about soils from the Mesa Rose Society. That 20-page, I did send the link so that those of you that would like to copy that can copy it, because that has some good basic information on the soils. And I'd also like to point out that that All About Soils was written by James Claridge, and James Claridge is a graduate of the University of Arizona in agronomy. And so that was his area of study, and he also taught at Mesa Community College. And I like to say that James Claridge went to that fine university to the south of that big university to the north.
All right. Next question is, what is rock dust used for?
Rock dust is simply, and there are several on the organic shelves, there are several fertilizers that do have rock dust. Those are, for the most part, volcanic materials that have some of the elements in them that are required. One of the things to remember with a number of the organic fertilizers is they put on their label those things that they want to test for and that they do test for. It does not mean there aren't some other things in other nutrients or other elements in their fertilizer.
All right. How do you apply compost to individual roses in the ground?
Spread it around the rows 1.5 to 2 inches deep, and leave it on the surface. And for the most part, that encourages worms and other things. And it gradually works its way down in the ground. You can rake it in a little bit, but with a garden as large as the Rose Garden at Mesa Community College, we're lucky to get the compost raked out, let alone rake it in.
All right. Do you recommend Alaska 511 liquid fish fertilizer?
I've used fish fertilizer, but I'm not sold that it's necessary, that or that there aren't other things that do the same thing without the smell and without attracting the neighborhood cats.
Okay. Next question. My soil is very alkaline, as is my water. Can green sand be used to help acidify?
No, the green sand is going to be mostly for the phosphorus. The best way to acidify is a combination of soil, sulfur, and compost. And the compost and soil sulfur break down bacterially, and the breaking that down produces a weak sulfuric acid, and that can lower the pH. And that's the way that we've had to learn to deal with high pH soils that we wanted to lower the pH. The other thing that you have to be careful of, though, with high pH soils is whether or not you've got other salts in there. And if there are some other salts, then those salts have to be leached.
Okay. Last question I have right now is it advisable to use mulch on top of compost?
Well, why would you? Most of they are used kind of interchangeably, compost and mulch. And are we talking about, when you talk about mulch, are you talking about an organic material? Now, you can mulch also with, for example, Home Depot has cedar bark mulch or shredded cedar. And that's a kind of a weak insecticide, kind of like why we used to build cedar chests out of cedar. For a short time, it's kind of an insect repellent, but that is a mulch. But compost, we use compost as a mulch also, as an upper layer to help reduce evaporation and to improve the condition of the soil. So it depends on what you're talking about as far as mulch.
Okay. All right. Did that answer everybody's question? Yeah, looks like we have another one. Recently I saw roses for sale with wax covering the canes. The sales associate told me the wax will be melted by the sun after planting and not hurt the plant. The wax is to protect the canes during shipping. Have you seen this, and what happens if the sun doesn't melt the wax?
I'll tell you, whoever sold that rose was selling a story, because that rose probably is not going to survive. Those of it, for the last 40, 50, no, more than that. I keep forgetting how old I am. The last 60 or 70 years, people would nurseries would dip roses in wax. And that wax in our climate heats up before it peels off. And once it heats up, it impregnates the bark and the rose is gone. And most of the time, wax roses are also packaged roses. And I have yet been able to keep a packaged rose alive longer than a year or two. It really does pay to buy good roses. And if you're buying them we're past the point of bare root roses. Most of the nurseries, including Mesquite Valley Nursery, have their roses in containers, and most of those nurseries are not selling their roses till they see roots throughout that container. Sometimes we order roses or we get roses from some of the nurseries that get them shipped in bare root, but that's always in December and January. And after the middle of January, it's almost too late to plant bare root roses.
Okay. One more question. How often do you compost?
The rose garden at MCC, we compost just once a year, and that is because we compost after we've done the pruning. The roses at the college were planted about 30 inches apart. The reason we planted them that close was because of how hot we get and to maintain a moisture level among the roses and a vapor level among the roses. And so consequently, we don't lose many roses during the summer unless somebody forgets to water. But generally, we have planted the roses about 30 inches apart so that we do keep that moisture level up. But we compost once a year. at home. I compost when I see that the ground needs it or I've got a sensitive area. And this year I have some chickens, and it looks like I'll be composting more during the summer, the way they scratch.
Okay. Any other questions?
Oh,
What?
let me bring up something. Some of you may enjoy Bob Martin, the president of the American Rose Society, is going to be giving a presentation next week on Thursday at the Mesa East Valley Rose Society, and it'll be online. It will be on Zoom. And if there are some of you that would like to tune in, I'll be glad to, I can send Terry the link to that.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
Mhm.
It's always a pleasure.
All right. Does anybody else have anything to add before we wrap it up? I got one more something in the chat. Thank you. Lots of thank yous. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much, LeRoy. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. We had a good turnout. And I will see you guys next month, I guess. All right. All right.
Well,
Happy gardening.
If Terry and Lou want to continue, we can cover the 890 pages tonight.
Yes, let's do it.
It's bedtime. It's bedtime.
It's bedtime. All right. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody. I'll see you
Good to
later.
see all of you.
Thank you, LeRoy.
All right.
Thank you.